Welcome to the debate. Imagine an architect who builds a breathtaking monument using this massive, intricate network of wooden scaffolding. He uses it to reach the heights, lay the stones, and secure the foundation. But upon completion, the architect issues a strict, unequivocal order. Burn the scaffolding. The monument must stand completely alone. Today we are asking if the Prophet Muhammad issued that exact order. Did he explicitly command the destruction of all his recorded sayings, the vast literature known as the hadith, so that the Quran would stand completely alone as the solitary religious authority?
It is. It's really one of the most provocative and fiercely contested questions in Islamic jurisprudence. And what makes it so fascinating is that this isn't just some modern, secular critique of religion.
Right, it's historical.
Exactly. The idea that the Prophet actively suppressed his own sayings is rooted deeply in the earliest historical Islamic texts. It's in the documented actions of his closest companions, and even in the linguistic analysis of the Quran itself. It really forces us to ask how a divine text that explicitly claims to be entirely self-sufficient ended up paired with a sprawling multi-volume secondary library of human narrations.
And setting the stage for our discussion today, I will be arguing from the traditionalist perspective. The position here is that while there are indeed documented prohibitions of hadith recording early in Islam, they were temporary, pragmatic measures, and that the Prophet's lived traditions, his sunnah, remain a vital, indispensable operational extension of the faith.
And I will be taking the revisionist perspective, arguing that the prohibition was not, a temporary clerical sticky note. It was an absolute theological mandate, strictly enforced by early Islamic leaders to ensure the Quran alone remained the solitary guide, completely free from human contamination.
To build the traditionalist case, we really have to immerse ourselves in the context of early 7th century Arabia. Now, I readily acknowledge the famous report by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri.
Ah, yes, in Sahih Muslim.
Right. It's recorded in Sahih Muslim, where the Prophet explicitly commands, "Do not write down anything of me except the Quran. Whoever writes other than that should destroy it."
Pretty clear.
Well, if you just read that one sentence, yes, it sounds like an absolute, eternal ban. But we have to look at the mechanics of what was actually happening on the ground at the time.
The mechanics of a burgeoning religious movement.
Exactly. You had a community of entirely new believers, many of whom were illiterate, receiving piecemeal divine revelation over 23 years. The Prophet had to completely prevent the accidental mixing of the literal word of God with his own human commentary, his daily speech, his explanations.
So a temporary measure.
It was a pragmatic firewall. You use the firewall while the system is vulnerable. Furthermore, the Quran repeatedly and emphatically commands believers to obey the messenger. The traditionalist views the Hadith not as a competitor to the Quran, but as its manual. The Quran is the Constitution. The Hadith is the localized case law that tells you how to actually drive on the highway.
I have to challenge that framework immediately, because treating the Prophet's ban on writing his words as a mere administrative firewall ignores the staggering historical and textual evidence pointing to a definitive theological mandate.
How so?
Well, the Prophet wasn't just organizing files to prevent people from accidentally blending verses together. He was actively preventing the creation of a secondary religious authority. And there is a profound, really inescapable irony sitting right in the middle of the traditionalist source material. We have hadiths prohibiting hadiths.
Right, the traditional texts themselves document their own suppression.
Precisely. We have accounts from prominent companions like Abu Huraira stating that the Prophet found people writing down his everyday sayings. He didn't just tell them to keep it in a separate folder. He asked them, "Are you creating a book other than the Book of God?" and ordered the text to be gathered and burned in a fire.
A literal fire?
Yes. All the early generations of Muslims, including the eventual hadith collectors themselves, acknowledged this strict ban. It is really the only logical explanation for why there was no authoritative, comprehensive hadith compilation for the first 2.5 centuries of Islam.
Well, let's talk about that early period, because I think the immediate aftermath of the Prophet's death is where this debate really catches fire. If this ban was as absolute as you say, we should look at the first 4 rightly guided caliphs. How did his closest companions, the people who actually sat with him, interpret his wishes?
They enforced it.
Now, to be entirely fair to your position, they did enforce a restriction. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, famously gathered 500 hadiths he had personally collected and burned them. And the second caliph, Umar ibn Khattab, was notoriously strict about this.
Yeah, notoriously strict barely captures the reality of Omar's reign. I mean, Omar's actions are really the cornerstone of the historical argument against the hadith literature. When the Prophet was on his deathbed and asked for a pen and paper to write something down, it was Omar who intervened and stopped it. And he justified it by famously declaring, "God's book is sufficient for us, hasbuna kitabullah."
And he carried that philosophy directly into his leadership.
He absolutely did. Omar ordered all pages of hadiths in the hands of the public in Medina to be brought to him, and he burned them. He sent official state letters to companions in other cities demanding they destroy their personal copies.
Wow, state letters.
Yes, officially. He even placed prominent companions like Abdullah bin Masud under house arrest in Medina specifically to stop them from traveling and narrating stories about the Prophet. But what is most fascinating is why Omar did this. He drew a brilliant and frankly terrifying historical parallel. He looked at Abu Huraira and others narrating these stories, and he explicitly compared their hadiths to the Jewish Mishnah.
And for those who might not be, steeped in comparative theology, let's unpack how that mechanism actually works.
Right. So Omar looked at the Jewish tradition where early scholars and rabbis compiled the Mishnah, which was an oral commentary and interpretation of the Torah. It was meant to explain the law. But over centuries, that commentary became so vast, so granular, and so authoritative that everyday believers ended up spending far more time studying the rabbis' interpretations than the actual original words of the Torah itself. The commentary swallowed the primary text.
The scaffolding obscures the monument.
Exactly. Omar was terrified of that exact psychological mechanism hijacking Islam. He recognized that human beings are fundamentally wired to prefer narrative. We love stories. It is infinitely easier for a person to read a highly specific, human skill story about what the Prophet ate, or how he dressed, or what he said in a specific battle, than it is to grapple with a dense, allegorical, divine revelation that demands high-level moral reasoning.
That makes sense.
Omar saw that these stories would inevitably usurp the divine text. He swore he would never replace God's book with anything else.
I completely understand Omar's anxiety, and the Mishnah it's a very powerful parallel. But let's go back to our constitution and case law analogy. The early caliphs, Abu Bakr and Omar, were the founding fathers trying to secure the constitution. During their reigns, the Quran was still being physically compiled into a single volume, standardized, and distributed across a rapidly expanding empire. The risk of contamination wasn't just theological, it was existential to the new faith.
So you're arguing the ban was purely circumstantial?
Yes. Their ban on hadith wasn't a permanent rejection of the Prophet's wisdom. They were using the scaffolding to protect the foundation of the building, the Quran, while the cement was still wet. Once the Quran was codified and deeply, unshakably secure within the Muslim consciousness, the scaffolding could be safely utilized to furnish the interior of the building.
I see.
But beyond the historical intentions, there is a glaring logical flaw in this entire line of argument. Aren't you trying to build a case against rumors on the strength of rumors?
How do you mean?
Well, you were quoting reports about Abu Bakr burning books. You're quoting Omar putting people under house arrest. You're quoting the Prophet telling people not to write anything down. You are using all of this to prove we shouldn't use hadith. But every single one of those reports is a hadith. You are literally relying on historical hearsay to invalidate the concept of historical hearsay.
Right. I understand why it looks like a paradox on the surface. But you have to consider the nature of an internal critique. Yes, it is heavily ironic, but I am not bringing these historical stories forward to establish a new religious law or a new doctrine. I am pointing to the traditionalists' own accepted historical corpus to show its fatal internal contradiction.
So it's a structural stress test of the traditionalist framework.
Exactly. If the traditional scholarly framework universally accepts the historical validity of collections like Bukhari, Muslim, and Musnad Ahmed, then they must intellectually reckon with the fact that these very texts document the Prophet and the Caliphs actively suppressing their creation.
Fair enough.
I don't actually need the historical hadiths to prove the prohibition is real. The history just gives us the socio-political context of how the ban played out. The ultimate proof doesn't lie in the rumors of what Omar did. It lies in the definitive, pristine text that both of our sides agree on, the Quran itself.
All right, then let's make that pivot. If the historical record is as compromised by hearsay and contradiction as you suggest, we have no choice but to look at the primary text. How does the Quran actually handle the concept of hadith?
This is where the evidence transitions from historical irony to staggering textual clarity. In all 20 instances where the Quran uses the Arabic word hadith to denote anything besides the Quran itself, it is used negatively. It is used with strong, undeniable disapproval. The Quran actively and repeatedly juxtaposes its own divine nature against human hadiths.
Walk us through the specific mechanism of how it does that in the text.
Sure. Take chapter 31, verse 6. It says, "And among the people there are those who purchase baseless hadiths to divert from the way of God without knowledge, making mockery of it." Or look at chapter 45, verse 6. "These are God's messages that we recite unto you in truth. So in which hadith after God and his messages will they believe?"
Fabricate secondary teachings to make the religion more palatable or to serve political ends, and it specifically calls those fabrications hadith. In chapter 39, verse 23, God says he has sent down the best hadith, explicitly referring to the Quran. It is warning believers in real time, do not uphold any other hadith but the Quran.
I hear the linguistic pattern you're establishing, but aren't you judging 7th century vocabulary by 9th century standards? This strikes me as a retroactive linguistic projection.
How so?
Well, in 7th century Arabic, the word hadith simply meant speech, a story, a conversation, or a narrative. It was a completely common noun. When the Quran asks, "In which hadith after this will they believe?" it is literally just asking, "In what statement or message after this will they believe?"
But the choice of that specific word is highly significant.
It is significant, but it's a general warning against idle gossip, false tales, or blasphemous stories that distract from God. You are taking a general noun and pretending it means the formal, rigorously authenticated scholarly hadith literature, capital H, that didn't even exist as an institution until Imam Bukhari came along 2 centuries later.
I understand the argument that it's an anachronism, but I fundamentally reject it based on the theological premise of the text itself. The Quran claims to be a timeless, eternal text. If it is the literal word of an omniscient God, it isn't bound by 7th century linguistic limitations.
Okay.
When the text repeatedly and precisely uses the exact word that would later become the label for the greatest theological contaminant in the religion, that is not an anachronism. That is a prophecy.
You see it as preemptive.
Exactly. Look at chapter 77, verse 50. "Then in which hadith after this will they believe?" The specific Arabic word used there for after is ba'dahu, which clearly alludes to a future time, a future text. Traditionalists often claim that their hadiths don't mock the Quran, they explain it. But when you have secondary literature that contradicts the Quran's equitable laws, its moral framework, or its historical narratives, those secondary texts are, by definition, making a mockery of the primary text. The Quran saw it coming and named it.
Let's test this in reality, because theology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has to be practiced. This brings us to the ultimate functional clash of our debate. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that you are right. We take those 20 verses at your strict interpretation, we burn the scaffolding, and we discard the entire secondary hadith corpus. What happens to the building? What happens to the actual daily practice of the faith?
The practice aligns perfectly with the divine text.
Does it? The Quran commands believers to establish prayer, salat, and to fast, but it completely lacks granular step-by-step instructions. It tells you to pray, but it doesn't give you the physical postures in a sequential manual.
Right.
It doesn't tell you to stand, bow, and prostrate in a highly specific, repeatable order. Without the Prophet's sunnah, his lived, physical traditions recorded in the hadith, the religion is effectively incomplete. The Quran tells us over and over to obey God and obey the messenger. If I have no record of the messenger's instructions, how do I obey him? How do I pray tomorrow morning?
The assertion that the Quran is incomplete is, from a strictly textual standpoint, a direct contradiction of the Quran itself. Chapter 12, verse 111, describes the book as a detailed explanation of everything. Chapter 6, verse 114 asks, "Shall I seek other than God as a judge when he has sent down to you the book fully detailed?"
But it's demonstrably not detailed when it comes to the mechanics of prayer.
Well, if God says the book is fully detailed, and human scholars say, no, it's missing the mechanics of prayer, we have to ask, who is right? The traditionalist argument fundamentally assumes that God forgot to put the prayer manual in the book or intentionally left it out, and therefore we desperately need a Persian scholar named Bukhari to fill in God's blanks 250 years later. That borders on theological insult.
So how do you pray?
You have to look at the Abrahamic continuum. The Quran isn't inventing prayer from scratch in a vacuum. It acknowledges that the practices of Abraham existed. It corrects them, modifies them, and sets the spiritual parameters. It gives the times of day, the requirement for ablution, the direction of prayer.
But no rigid sequence.
Right. If God didn't mandate a rigid, robotic sequence of physical mechanics, it means God left that flexible intentionally. As for obeying the messenger strictly means obeying the message he was commissioned to deliver. The Quran explicitly states the messenger's sole duty was the delivery of the message.
But the Prophet lived a life. He made decisions. He led a community. Surely his personal methodology matters?
His life matters historically, but not as a source of divine law alongside the Quran. In fact, if you look at the Arabic word sunnah in the Quran, it is consistently used in conjunction with God. Sunnat Allah, the sunnah of God. It means the way or method of God. The Quran never once uses the phrase sunnah of Muhammad. Elevating extra Quranic literature to divine status violates that principle. And look at the real-world consequences. This exact mechanism is the root cause of the Sunni-Shia sectarian split. You end up with different political factions following different collections of human hadiths, completely losing the unifying force of the single divine book. The scaffolding broke the monument.
I hear the structural purity of your argument, but I have to push back on a practical reality. It is incredibly difficult, perhaps impossible, to untangle the lived experience of over 1 billion believers from centuries of established practice.
It is difficult, yes.
The traditionalist doesn't view the hadith as correcting an incomplete Quran, but as the living, breathing manifestation of the Quran in the person of the Prophet. It prevents every single individual from inventing their own subjective version of the religion. Without the unifying practice of the Sunnah, Islam shatters into 1 million personalized, unrecognizable interpretations.
But the traditionalist framework already shattered Islam into warring sects.
That is a fair critique of human political tribalism, yes. But I will concede this to you. The historical warnings from the early caliphs are undeniably severe. Abu Bakr and Omar's intense, almost violent fear of a secondary text overshadowing the Quran is a highly valid theological anxiety. We see in other traditions how human commentary can slowly eclipse divine revelation.
We absolutely do.
The danger of elevating human traditions, which are inherently subject to memory lapses, single-source witnessing, political manipulation, and sheer human error, is very real. There is a reason traditional Islamic scholars literally spend their entire lives grading hadiths as weak, forged, or authentic. The system is inherently fragile because it is human.
And I will happily concede that the human desire to contextualize a monumental figure like the Prophet Muhammad is deeply, fundamentally natural. People wanted to know how he walked, how he spoke, how he judged disputes, even how he laughed. It is entirely understandable why the scaffolding was salvaged and rebuilt.
Right, it's human nature.
And I acknowledge the immense, almost insurmountable practical disorientation that traditionalists feel when someone suggests discarding centuries of codified ritual. If you strip away the hadith, you are left alone with a dense, intellectually demanding text. You can no longer rely on a scholar's regurgitation of an 8th century hearsay chain. You have to take absolute personal responsibility for understanding your faith. That is terrifying for most people.
It is a profound paradigm shift. But as we synthesize these opposing views, despite our massive operational disagreements on the utility of the hadith, the primary source material forces us toward a powerful point of convergence. Whether we are looking at the pragmatic safeguards of early Islam or the absolute revisionist mandates, one inescapable conclusion emerges from the text itself. The Quran unequivocally presents itself as the supreme and ultimately solitary, necessary guide for faith.
I completely agree. We may fiercely debate whether the historical scaffolding has any cultural or practical value today, but the architecture of the monument itself is undeniable. Elevating any secondary text, whether it be a collection of hadiths, the concept of an extra Quranic sunnah, or centuries of scholarly consensus, to the infallible level of the Quran, fundamentally contradicts the core, repeated message of the text itself. The true path, as explicitly laid out in the primary source material, relies on the Quran alone as the ultimate arbiter of truth.
It really highlights the immense value in revisiting these early historical paradoxes. Visualizing Omar enforcing his bans, or Abu Bakr burning his own collected scrolls, it forces us to rigorously question the mechanisms of belief systems that so many take for granted. There is vastly more to explore in this source material, from the sheer unreliability of multi-generational oral transmission to the intense socio-political pressures of the Umayyad and Abbasid empires that finally forced the hadiths onto paper centuries later.
It leaves us grappling with a fundamental tension between what divine texts demand of us and what human psychology naturally craves.
Indeed. If the architect explicitly tells us to burn the scaffolding so we can truly experience the monument, why are we still so obsessed with the wood?